Hi, and welcome to Galatians chapter 6. It has been a joy to be talking about Galatians with you, and next week we're going to move into Ephesians. I love reading the Word, and this whole meditation journey is very, very powerful. I hope that you will continue with the study, reading it and listening to it every day. Literally, I actually observed that chapter 6 was less than 3 minutes to listen to it. I encourage you to continue listening and reading in different versions. I'm reading from my Jeremiah Study Bible, which is the New King James Version, which is one of the versions that is translated from the original Greek and Hebrew. Also the NASB and ESV, and there's a couple other versions. I actually looked up the Jeremiah Study Bible and all the different versions that Pastor has applied his study notes to. And so it's important to read a direct translation, and then we can enjoy like the New Living Translation and those that are paraphrases or thought by thought translations, and looking at the two can deepen our understanding. So just a thought about how we're reading. Well, in chapter 6 of Galatians, we have to reflect upon the build that the Apostle Paul is making. He is dealing with several churches in Galatia. They've got the Jews who lost their homes. They're dispersed all over the known world because of persecution. And they are in a Gentile population. It is a Roman-ruled province. And the Jews probably in many ways don't feel like they have anything except their religion and their rules and the whole you need to be circumcised. And that's what they've been telling the Gentiles over here. And this is where the Apostle Paul is saying, it's not your rules and religion. It's faith in Jesus Christ, and that's what's going to bring you together. This is epic because this was altering, life-altering for both the Jews and the Gentiles, because they had their own sets of rules and culture that were very, very religious-based. We've got the pagan problems, the horrible sexual sins, and you might as well have looked at those pagan priests, many of them, and I might have said it in my last video, but many of the practices of those pagan religions, those priests just could have been called pimps and perverts, because it was terrible. In fact, when you look at the sins listed in the end of Galatians 6, it covers a whole bunch of things: sexual sins, lewdness, uncleanness, but it also talks about hatred and contentions and outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions. So the Apostle Paul is just laying out a list of problems that this church was dealing with in their sin. So he continues to have a conversation. There's the law and the human way of doing things, following human effort, but then there's the faith way. And then he moves it down the road further in discussion of living by the flesh, the sin nature or the old nature, and living by the Spirit, the new nature, and how they are in conflict. Because our flesh, our human nature, our emotions, our bodies, everything around us in this world is not perfect. It's because of sin. And we need to be redeemed. And the burdens of sin can be lifted through a spiritual renewal of faith in Jesus Christ. In other words, we're made new in how we process through life. Remember, the Galatian church was framed in a lot of tensions between the two cultural groups, the Jews and the Gentiles, not to mention their corrupt leadership and the Roman government. But you know what? Faith in Jesus did not remove that. These Christians were to live through the problems of their culture, through the power of faith and walking in the Spirit, living by the fruit of the Spirit. I can't help thinking of Old Testament scenarios where God did not change their cultural setting. The Jews, the Israelites in the Old Testament, were slaves for 400 years in Egypt. Joseph was a slave, and Daniel lived in captivity. He was not in his homeland. Esther was not in her homeland either. In other words, they lived in very, very pagan, non-godly rule, and God did not change their culture. And even today, as we live through very big challenges with the virus, COVID-19 situations, political unrest, we are to live through these difficult times through the power of the Holy Spirit, just like the Galatian church was. Now, in the study guide, we think in terms of the people and places to help us gain a deeper understanding and help us to remember something, and then what we can learn about God and also key words. Well, in the opening of chapter 6, Paul mentions brethren, which would be brothers and sisters. So he's talking to the Galatians, and he talks about someone overcome by a trespass or sin. And this is what he says: you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, and consider yourself, lest you also be tempted. So he's speaking of the different types of people: someone who's caught in sin, trespasses, and someone who is spiritual. So those two types of people existed, but he said we are to gently restore them back to faith, and we are to clearly observe those who we can encourage to leave their lifestyle of sin. Then he also speaks of someone else, a different type of person, and it is, if anyone thinks himself to be something, this is in verse 3, when he is nothing, he deceives himself. So in other words, the proud. We are not supposed to be proud. So right in this congregation of the Galatian churches, we learn that there are going to be people walking in sin. There are going to be people who are more spiritual, and there are going to be the prideful. But where are we supposed to be? We are to be examining ourselves. Verse 4, let each one of you examine his own work, because we have a personal accountability. And let me tell you, we're going to learn some things about God in the next couple verses. In verses 6 and 7, we learn that we are not to be deceived, that God is not mocked. Did you know God is not mocked, and he is not deceived by our behaviors? In fact, we can see from here, not everybody gets a trophy from God, because he has set up a mechanism in our human behaviors of reaping and sowing. So Paul's using a farming word picture. What we plant is what we're going to get, or what we're going to reap. So what I put into my life, there's going to be consequences. God is a person who says you need to look at the consequences of your life. For he who sows to his flesh, or his sin nature, will of the flesh reap corruption, ultimately death, or we could just translate a lot of problems. But he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. And let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not lose heart. So the Apostle Paul is saying there are consequences to your choices. You need to come together in faith. You need to restore each other. Don't be proud. And stay faithful. In fact, he even says, pay extra attention to those who are teaching you, and also those who are of the household of faith. I believe he mentions those who are teaching you in chapter 5. But we're not to grow weary. We have the ability to walk in the Spirit while here on earth, but look forward to everlasting life. And we are not to grow weary as we live with eternity in mind and everlasting life. The Apostle Paul mentioned some personal comments about how he wrote this letter. And to me, this is my Debbie paraphrase. It's almost like he says, get along. Don't bother me about this anymore. And in verse 17, from now on, let no one trouble me, for I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. He'd been physically maimed, beaten, hurt because of his love for Jesus and serving the Lord. And he just wants them to be solid in their faith. And just before that, in verse 16, he says, as many as walk according to this rule, which is the rule of being a new creation, which is mentioned in verse 15. Peace and mercy be upon them. Ladies, I pray peace and mercy on you. Love, joy, and peace. Walk in the Spirit. Let's leave behind the old nature. Now it's a maintenance thing. We have to keep aiming to walk in the Spirit. And let's keep reading and thinking the Word and be transformed. And look at those key words of the Spirit and new creation and all those fruit of the Spirit listed in chapter 5. All right. Bye-bye for now.